relationship with Dante is, at least to my mind, uniquely special. Our experiencing of Dante is one that is protean, indeed vital to our kind of creative energies, the creative energies of our best artists, mostly the literary ones. Since our very earliest literature, the afterlife, its representations and configurations, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani or the Visio Tonoctali, the afterlife has exerted an enduring hold on the Irish imagination and indeed influenced European cultural expression in the Middle Ages, and not least Dante. For example, the Visio Tonoctali, or the Vision of Tonocto, is a 12th century religious text reporting the otherworldly vision of the Irish night, Tonoctalis, later called Tondulus, or in English translation, Tundle, all deriving from that kind of original Middle Irish Tonoctal, meaning desire valor or fierce valor. And it was the most popular and indeed elaborate text in the medieval genre of visionary infernal literature, and had been translated from the original Latin 43 times into 15 languages by the 15th century. And it's said that Tonoctal had his vision after passing out at a dinner in Cork. Now, I don't know what that says about Cork meals, but nonetheless, this is where he had his vision. But the parallels with this text and with Dante's vision are fascinating. And I think in general terms also, the Irish context provides many, many more examples of medieval vision literature in Europe. So there is a kind of a strong tradition of that here. It is not commonly commented on, but the first actual translation of the entire Commedia, this was done also by an Irishman, Henry Boyd, in 1802. Boyd was probably educated at Trinity College in Dublin, and he died in Ballintemple near Newry in 1832. Now, as I said, in 1802, Boyd issued 3 volumes of an English verse translation of the whole of the Divine Comedy, with preliminary essays, notes, and illustrations, which is dedicated to the Viscount Charleville, whose chaplain the author is described to be in the title page. In the dedication, Boyd states that the terrors of the Irish rebellion had driven him from the post of danger at Lord Charleville's side to seek safe asylum in a remote angle of the province. So this would be, I think, a bit of a recurring theme, as Dante and Irish politics tend to go hand in hand. And what about Dante Oscuelga? Well, it was not until the 20th century that Dante made his way into the Irish language, this time in 1963, by the indomitable Monsignor Padraig de Brún. You can see him there in the photo, second from the left in the front row, one away from Eamon de Valera, seated in the centre. This translation of Dante into Irish was, to a certain degree, part of a wider project to make available the European canon in Irish, and let our native tongue partake more fully in that canon. But I think it is really with the Irish writers in the English language that the importance of Dante comes to the fore most forcibly. I'll only mention a couple of these, but there are many, many more. What needs to be stated, I think, at the outset is that these are our most important writers, and each one, I think, with varying degrees of engagement, turn to Dante and they inscribe him into their poetics. Though perhaps less evident than in the others, Yeats's Ego Dominus Tuus gives us an indication of a Dantean presence. And although Yeats refers to Dante several times in his early prose writings, it's not until 1915, with the writing of this poem, that he begins to show kind of a serious interest. The words of the title, taken from the 3rd chapter of the Vita Nuova, are spoken by Amore, that Signore di pauroso aspetto, who has appeared to Dante in a vision, who will henceforth dominate Dante through Beatrice. And according to Yeats's poem, the Signore of the vision is the embodiment of Dante's anti-self and represents that supremely chaste love which Dante's work will celebrate. I think nowhere is the relationship between Dante and Ireland more striking than in the next 2 examples. But let's start with Joyce first. Joyce's procedures of literary allusion, what he calls quashed quotatos in Finnegan's Wake evokes that kind of shared idea of directly implicating poets, epic, philosophical, lyric, in this introspective process of his own making. A procedure, I think, which he learns from Dante. Such enrollment declares an impassioned prodigality of the self, a pulse of creativity so vehement that it requires the representation of an echo, its mirroring in others, comparably creative, kinetic even. Dante is there in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Dante is there in Dubliners. Dante is there in Ulysses, and also wonderfully there in Finnegan's Wake. The Commedia is a storehouse of language, motif. It's an arresting image, a beguiling presence in what we may call the kind of shadow theatre of encounters. And this, I think, is especially true of Samuel Beckett and his rapport with Dante, which is even more intense than Joyce's. Dante is both an intertextual presence at various turns, as well as an inspiration for character and setting. And we need only think of Beckett's Bellacqua, or the purgatorial mindscapes of Waiting for Godot, or indeed Endgame, to get a sense of Dante's presence. And Beckett, it is said, carried a copy of Dante everywhere he went. Now, what is undoubtedly true of these giants of European modernism is that both Joyce and Beckett studied at university what today we call modern languages, Italian in particular, and therefore they read Dante assiduously in the original. They did not hide under the yoke of English literature, but rather went searching for contesting canons in different vernaculars. They embraced the idea of linguistic plurality, which is at once subversive and protean. In more recent times, modern Irish poets have looked at Dante in interesting new ways. Seamus Heaney's Station Island announces his discovery of the Florentine, and from then on he becomes this haunting presence. He is not the aquiline patron of international modernism a la Eliot, but rather a Dante who is a voluble Shakespearean figure, what he calls, very memorably, a woodcutter singing at his work in the dark wood of the larynx. Dante also furnishes Heaney with the keys to delve poetically into this island's divided histories. Equally, Kieran Carson's beautifully rendered translation of Inferno, like Heaney's, evokes our troubled history, rendering a Dante who is now. And this is not a translation in the strict sense, but a leap of kind of poetic faith into language. Alongside these poets, there were many, many others. Bernard O'Donoghue, who spoke wonderfully at this series a number of years ago, and who has, like his predecessors, furnished us with wonderful poetic versions of segments of Dante's poems. But alongside him, we could name many others like Matthew Sweeney and Philip Terry, and the list goes on and on. But what about Dante in the academic realm here in Cork and UCC in particular? Is there a Cork connection with Dante? Well, Mary Ryan, who was the first female professor on the island of Ireland, was a professor of Romance languages. And one of the photos here was taken on the occasion of the NUI honorary conferring in 1952. Though French and German were her stronger languages, she was passionate about Dante and did publish on him. And this is from a 1921 article from the journal Studies with the title Dante Discovery. And equally, the first professor of Italian here at UCC, Pietro Calli, published the excellent Allegory and Vision in Dante and Langland in 1971. That is to say that Dante has and had and continues to have a special place here in UCC. So all of this really just brings me to the establishment of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland. The CDSI, as we're calling it, supports a transdisciplinary culture of collaborative research across the various strands of Dante studies. The centre is part of and housed in the Department of Italian, University College Cork, and CASALAC, the Centre for Advanced Studies in Languages and Cultures. The CDSI seeks to respond to a genuine need within the Irish academic, creative and intellectual communities to have an Irish-based centre which not only fosters world-class research on the figure of Dante and the myriad of related fields relating to him, medieval studies, medievalism, modern and contemporary poetry, narrative, music, art, philosophy, theology and creative practice, but which engages with the wider public in exploring how Dante's encyclopedic Divina Commedia creates a rich dialogue with today on notions centered on ideas such as citizenship, exile and migration, moral choice and responsibility, conflict resolution, and the polysemous nature of language, and much else besides. The centre is founded on 3 pillars: research, which I'll come to in a minute, education, and outreach. And it really had its beginning back in 2011 when we established the Dante Public Lecture Series. For 11 years now, we have welcomed to Cork an array of international scholars, Danteisti and not Danteisti. We have asked our own colleagues here in UCC from very different fields to consider and talk about Dante, which they've done with their usual grace and excellence. And we have asked poets and translators to explain their peculiar passion for a Florentine that lived 700 years ago. And I here want to thank publicly Professor Terry O'Reilly for encouraging me in this very foolhardy enterprise. His gentle persuasion and enthusiasm encouraged me, I think, to bring this to fruition. Equally, none of these lectures would have been possible without the support of all our local, national and international colleagues who came on board, some more than once, and at a very short notice as well. And I also want to thank my colleagues in the Department of Italian for allowing me the space to develop and to grow it. Mark and Sylvia as heads of department, and all my other colleagues for corralling bemused students to these lectures, Gabriella, Chiara, and everyone else, and especially Marco and Michi for indulging my demands for the annual poster. This lecture series is not an original idea, however, and it comes, I think, from a need for continuity here in Ireland. The lectures are direct descendants of the UCD, that is the University College Dublin Dante Lecture Series that Professor John Barnes and before him David Nolan ran for so many years in Dublin. When these lectures were discontinued, I asked John if I could continue the idea of them here in UCC in Cork. And he immediately said yes, and gave me the iconic profile image of Dante that you see on the posters and now serves as this centre's logo. And when it comes to Dante, I am personally indebted to Cormac O'Quillanone and especially Corinna Salvadori Lonergan. And they were the ones who taught me Dante as an undergraduate. And they also taught me as a colleague when I worked with them in Trinity. And they continue to teach me every day. So I really owe them a huge debt of gratitude. This year's series has been different, to say the least. But it has been wonderful to welcome new friends and colleagues from all around the world. Every lecture of our series has had over 100 people attending, so that has been excellent. The discussions have been vibrant, and Simon, Zig, Lino, and Alison, they were brilliant, and so our thanks to them. So next year, hopefully, we'll be able to do the lectures in person, but I think we're going to go with a hybrid model, which will hopefully bring back our new audience. So, as I mentioned, research is one of the main pillars of the centre. Already we have a track record in collaborative and individual outputs, and this has been, I think, quite impressive. The volume on the right-hand side here is the latest monograph from my colleague David Bowe, which was published last December by Oxford University Press, and we'll be launching that in a couple of weeks' time. More of that anon. What we particularly care about, though, is the fostering of new research from earlier career researchers. And this year alone has seen further examples of the research excellence of the centre. The latest issues of some of the top journals in the field of Dante Studies has seen the publication of wonderful articles by members of the Centre, Dario Galassini in La Livraghi and Federica Colluzzi in Dante Studies, and David Bowe's edited volume on the illustrations of Dante's Inferno by Rachel Owen will be published later this year. So when I said that we try to nurture early career researchers, I say it also because more often than not, their research is at, I think, the cutting edge of research in these fields. Early next year, when we'll also see the publication of an edited volume, simply with a simple title, Dante and Ireland, and that will be published with Four Courts Press. The volume will contain essays by John Carey and Dagmar Oreen, who will be concentrating on the medieval aspect of, let's call them Dantean precursors. Federica Colluzzi and Leyla Bowe will be writing an essay on Henry Boyd, their translator of the Commedia. Alan Titley and Aidan Doyle will both individually write articles on Padraig de Boone's Irish translation, Alessandro Gentili on John Montague, Cormac O'Quillan on the kind of the visual experience of it, the visual artists and Dante in Ireland. Corinna Lonergan will have an essay on Dante and Beckett. Bernard Donoghue will on Dante and the Irish Poets, and John Barnes on the history of the Dante lecture series in UCD, and yours truly on a few things. So that's one to look out for, and the book will kind of cover the ground that I'm covering at the moment in much greater detail and nuance. So what I thought we'd do now is to hand over the space to our wonderful centre members and let them tell you about their research. I'm going to introduce them now collectively, and then they will pass seamlessly from one to the other as they give their mini presentations of some of their research work. First, we're going to have Dr. David Bowe, who is the co-director of the CDSI. He's also an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow here in the Department of Italian. He previously held teaching and research positions at Somerville, Pembroke and Balliol colleges at the University of Oxford, where he also studied for his PhD. His research focuses on the representation of feminine voices in medieval and early modern Italian texts, Dante, early vernacular lyric poetry, and the mediation and adaptation of Dante's works in literature and the visual arts. As we just saw, his first published monograph, Poetry and Dialogue in the Duecento and Dante, was published by OUP, and we're going to launch that in a couple of weeks' time. And he's published much else besides, including the Rachel Owen illustrations coming soon. Dr. Federica Colluzzi is a Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the University of Warwick, with a project titled Dante's Transnational Female Public in the long 19th century, 1789 to 1921, which would provide the first systematic inquiry into the historical formation and development of Dante's modern female audience in Britain, Ireland, and Italy. And her research encompasses reception theory, Dante studies, intellectual history, and the history of publishing and reading in the long 19th century. Prior to that, she was IRC postdoctoral fellow here at University College Cork. And she is completing her monograph, Dante Beyond Influence, Rethinking Reception in Victorian Literary Culture. This is forthcoming with Manchester University Press. Dr. Valentina Mele received her BA in Italian Literature and her MA in Philology at the Università degli Studi di Padova. She continued her studies at Somerville College and the University of Oxford, doing a master's in medieval and modern languages. And that thesis analysed textual representations of feminine figures in the Italian Duecento love lyric. Valentina holds a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and her doctoral research focuses on the poetry of Guido Cavalcanti. So Valentina is currently an IRC postdoctoral fellow here at UCC, where she is working on her first monograph based on her PhD research. And Valentina's broader interests mostly lie in the relationship between language and subjectivity. Dr. Leyla Livraghi completed her PhD at the University of Pisa. She is, or rather will be, an IRC postdoctoral fellow here at UCC when she will be starting at the beginning of the next academic year. The title of her research topic is Livy's legacy in Dante, Petrarch and Boccaccio, and the practice of reading history in Italian culture from the late 13th to the 14th century. So she's been kind of studying the reception of classical authors in Dante's work for a few years now, with this particular focus on the Roman historian Livy, but not only in Dante, but also with Petrarch and Boccaccio, the so-called three crowns of the Italian tradition. And lastly, we have Dario Galassini. Dario completed his BA in Humanities and an MA in Italian Studies at the Università di Bologna, and his thesis explored Giorgio Caproni's poetic works from 1965 to 1986 and his ties to Dante's Inferno, Canto 1. He was recently awarded the Eduardo Saccone PhD scholarship by the UCC Department of Italian for a research project entitled Poete che mi guidi, Dante in Afterlives in the Poetry of Giorgio Caproni, Antonia Potsi, Vittorio Sereni, and Mario Luzzi. This then is the team. David, a te la parola.
Grazie, Dara. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone else for being here. It's lovely to see so many faces from so many time zones. Special prize goes to Emma for being here from Australia, which I think is around 6 a.m. or thereabouts. So thank you very much for being up this early. So today I'm going to give you a very potted example of the kind of things that I'm interested in my project, and one of the things that became most striking to me over the course of my work on the representation, as Dara mentioned, of feminine voices in the early Italian tradition. This starts with lyric and goes beyond through the Commedia, through the works of Dante, through up into the work of Boccaccio and Catherine of Siena, which is where this kind of project winds up. But what I want to do today is just give you a really nice focused example of what I mean when I talk about these things, and one of the ways in which an approach that encompasses various forms of text, various forms of representation of feminine voices by both men and women writing in this period, how those things kind of resonate, the kind of creative spaces and the discussions they create, and the different ways that they go about representing voice, gender and subjectivity. I have those interests also in common with Valentina. So what you see in front of you is a page of a manuscript, the Vatican manuscript, Vaticano Latino 3793, otherwise known as the Vatican Canzoniere, or Canzoniere Vaticano, or the Vatican Songbook. It is one of the so-called canzonieri of Italian lyric. It dates to the very end of the 13th or very beginning of the 14th century. And it's a significant record of what we might describe as a kind of proto-canon of Italian vernacular poetry, particularly lyric poetry. It contains work by a lot of the kind of major names of the early tradition, as well as anonymous poems and poems by poets who you probably never heard of. One of the poets contained in its many leaves is La compiuta Donzella di Firenze, and you see here two poems attributed to her name: La compiuta Donzella di Firenze, the upper poem, and then La compiuta medesima, that same computa, in the second poem on this manuscript folio. This is striking because she represents the only woman to whom any poetry is attributed in this manuscript. In fact, she remains the only woman to whom any poetry, surviving poetry, is attributed in manuscript form in the early Italian tradition. While there are some other suggestions of women writing lyric poetry in this period, none survives in manuscript form with an attribution in this way. There has been, as is often the case when we find early examples of women's writing in the European tradition at least, much toing and froing over the identity of her as a poet, of whether we're actually talking about a woman writing, about whether these poems are in some way fundamentally biographical, or and whether that tells us that she's a woman. I'm not particularly, and I never have been particularly interested in that debate, but I do come down very firmly on the side that these being texts written by a woman, until somebody can prove me otherwise. And I'm happy to go into that more later in discussion, but if you want to kind of see my reasons for that, they're in an article I published in 2018 in Italian Studies called Versions of a Feminine Voice, the Computer Donzella Differenze. What I'm interested in today is looking at the way that she represents a speaking figure, a female persona, who is existing in the world in the kind of the ambience of 13th century Florence, and who is facing some of the realities that may have been faced by women at the time, or were faced by women at the time, and is expressing this persona. And again, I'm differentiating between the author and the persona here because I don't want to fall into this common trap of viewing the all poetry by a woman in this period as somehow autobiographical. She's also someone who's creating a poetic style and a poetic self in much the same way as her contemporaries. Is someone who's exploring the ways in which, or this persona might respond to the difficulties of being a woman whose father is wanting to marry her off, and who has no desire to be married, and in fact would rather enter a nunnery and commit her life to God. That is the content, the fundamental content of the second poem you can see on this slide, and I'm going to move over now to show you the text a little bit more clearly, or rather Daragh is going to move over now for me to show you the text a little bit more clearly, here with my slightly scrappy translation, so I apologize that that's not the it's not the smoothest, but in this poem, La Computer Donzella di Firenze writes it from the perspective of a woman who wishes to enter a convent rather than marry. Lasciar vorr'io lo mondo e Dio servire e di partirmi d'ogni vanitate, però che veggio crescere e salire mattezza e vilania e falsitate, ed ancor senno e cortesia morire, e lo fin pregio e tutta la bontate. Ond'io marito non vorria né sire, né stare al mondo per mia volontate. Membrandomi cognom di mal s'adorna, di ciaschedun son forte disdegnosa, e verso Dio la mia persona torna. Lo Padre mio mi fa stare pensosa, che di servire a Cristo mi distorna, non saccio a cui mi vol dar per risposa. As you can see in the English translation, she's expressing this desire to serve God, leave the world, not to marry, but that her father is instead trying to force her into marriage anyway to someone to who knows who, some bloke or other. She carefully contrasts through her use of rhyme words and other aspects in the text, her desire to turn towards Christ and her father's desire to turn her away from Christ towards an earthly matrimony. The other thing that I wanted to point out, and the thing that's going to be particularly pertinent for what I'm going to just show you today, is the emphasis on the verb volere and its cognate. So the verb to want or to will or to wish. We have vorria, we have volontate, non vorria, we have mi vol dar per risposa, and so on. So this is a text in which a clash of the wills is very much played out. Her own will, which is not being respected, and her father's will, which is contrary to her will, and by implication also contrary to God, as he turns her away from the person of God to whom she wishes to turn. And if we could move on to the next slide, the reason that I want to zoom in on this particular moment is because of the interesting resonance that it has with a moment in Dante's Commedia, and that is the encounter with Picarda in the first sphere of paradise, specifically in Paradiso 3, Canto 3, where he meets those souls who are redeemed, but nonetheless did break their vows in life. And he meets the figures of Picarda and Costanza. And it is, in fact, the figure of Picarda, the first soul to talk to Dante in Paradiso, who, in many ways, who tells the story of her own life, her own attempt to flee into a convent, and the lesson, or not exactly the lesson, but the experience of the will that she has undergone over the course of her life and salvation. So Dara, if we could move on, that would be great. Thank you. I've given you a very truncated quotation because I wanted to try and keep this to a minimum number of slides, but also because I think this gives us enough of an idea of something which echoes throughout many more lines in this passage. In fact, from about line 67 all the way through to line 108 of this canto, there is this repeated focus on the notion of will, using both volere, voglia, and its cognates, and desire, desio, which, although shaded in a different manner, is still has this kind of same sense of that which is wished for. Now, interestingly, in this instance, we have the discussion of will and what is willed extensively before we hear the life story of the figure in question. The discussion of the will, discussion of what is desired, what is not desired, is represented as far more as the kind of the important part of the discourse. And then at the end, we have this personal history, which gives a context to the discussion which has gone before, yes, but which is not the kind of primary focus in many ways of this episode. What happens in this episode is that Dante, after a kind of moment of slapstick where he thinks the souls he sees in front of him are in fact mirrors of his own face, does a kind of 180 and is corrected by a laughing Beatrice, asks about, is intrigued by the notion of the ranks of heaven, that there are apparently ranks of the blessed. There isn't just a kind of uniform level of blessedness. There is this kind of these tiers of the degrees of blessedness. And what Picardo kind of amusedly and graciously explains is that the only thing that matters is that their wills and God's are completely aligned, are at one, and therefore their peace is in his will, the way he wills things to be, and that this idea of rank isn't really something that they're bothered about. So she utters the line in sua volontà in nostra pace. And here you can see how she's talking about the kind of convergence between the wills of the soul and the wills of God. Anzi è formale adesto beato esse tenersi dentro alla divina voglia, percuna fansi nostre voglie stesse, sì che come noi sem di soglia in soglia per questo regno a tutto il regno piace, come allo re che in suo voler ne invoglia. You can see the kind of the echoing of this kind of this conversation about this kind of concern with what is willed and the turning of the will towards God, and here actually the unifying of the will, the total unifying of the will with God, which is very much something that Picard that in the persona of the Computer Doncella's poem seems to be wishing for, against the resistance of her earthly father. If we then read the rest of follow on in Peccato Donati's story, dal mondo per seguirla, la being St. Clair here, i.e. she's entering to the Port Clairs, per seguirla giovinetta fuggimi e nel suo abito mi chiusi e promisi la via della sua setta. Uomini poi a mal più che a bene usi, fuor mi rapiron della dolce chiostra, e Dio si sa qual poi mi vita fusi. She also wishes to enter. She, in fact, does manage to enter the convent, but is dragged from it. And we know from very early commentaries that she was dragged from it by Corso Donati, her brother, who then married her off for his own kind of political and social gain. This is, again, a woman who is trying to devote herself to God, who attempts to devote herself to God, and has that attempt curtailed by by a family patriarch, a kind of patriarchal will on earth defying the will of God the Father. And the irony, I don't think, is lost on either Dante or the Computer Doncella of this clash of paternal figures. Now, it would be very tempting to say, well, to ask whether the Computer Doncella's poetry is in Dante's mind here. I'm not going to say that today, as much as kind of part of me wants to believe it. But what I will say is that there is a kind of resonance, a significant resonance between these two texts, both in the ways that they narrate feminine will and feminine agency, and in the ways in which they articulate the problems inherent in this kind of clash of earthly and divine duties and powers, specifically focused in the kind of patriarchal structures of the family. I don't want to overstay my welcome, and I know that Dara is keeping a very close eye on the time. But in the kind of the broader sense of this reading, what I think it does is and what it demonstrates, I think, in what I hope it demonstrates in terms of my approach and my project overall, is that by essentially starting at the beginning of the tradition and working our way through and picking up texts which deal with or represent the voices and themes that we're interested in, we can see resonances which we wouldn't necessarily have seen if we kind of read in a more Dante-centric way. And I've talked about this passage in at greater length in a talk recently on Dante Decentered, for example, where I'm really trying to think about ways that we can kind of talk around Dante and recognize that the works of Dante are significant, are a hugely significant canonical text, that they've established their position as a kind of major text of the tradition, and in many ways for good reason, but that we can both learn more things about them as texts, but also I think appreciate the tradition that Dante's texts emerge from more fully if we kind of try and read without Dante and then come back to Dante. As far as it's possible to read without Dante and then come back to Dante, and that's kind of, it's a practice that I first pursued in my first book, which Daragh was kind enough to mention, where again I very much start by working my way through a series of texts that are not by Dante, by poets who are not Dante, and reading them on their own terms before finally arriving at a reading of Dante that is informed by those other readings, but does not, or at least that I try to avoid as far as possible, an inflection of those readings through the lens of Dante. So I'm not trying to read the period through Dante, I'm trying to read Dante through the period, if that makes sense. And here I'm trying to bring it to bear specifically on the question of these voices, which are somewhat underrepresented in the Italian tradition, and certainly understudied in the Italian tradition, in large part because of the ways in which they're often embedded within texts in dialogue, or they are voices within longer texts. They are not, there isn't kind of a distinct genre of texts in written from a woman's perspective as there are in other languages and other traditions. So that's kind of a mini case study of some of the things I'm doing, a kind of an entry point into some of the things I'm working on, and a little bit of the rationale for why I'm doing it. And I'm going to leave it there. And if there are any kind of, I'm sure there'll be some chance for discussion at the end, but I'm looking forward to hearing also from my colleagues. So I will stop talking.
Okay. So thank you, David. Good evening, everyone. My name is Federica Colluzzi, and I'll get right into it. So what do we talk about when we talk about Dante's reception? With this question, I opened my Dante public lecture back in 2019, an event that marked the beginning of my personal and professional relationship with the Future Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland and the wider UCC research community. 2 years after, the question still holds a crucial significance, being at the heart of my past project as an IRC postdoctoral fellow at UCC and my present work as a Livium fellow at the University of Warwick. The Carverian question, if you like, emerged from observing the transformation of the scope of Dante reception studies in Britain since their unofficial foundation in the early 1900s with the publication of Paget Toynbee's records, and you might be familiar with his Dante in English literature from Chaucer to Carey. His representation of the phenomenon back then rested on a capacious notion of literature, embracing a vast and miscellaneous corpus of responses. Over the course of the intervening century and up to the present day, however, the Toynbean concern for the generic and material variety of Dante's reception has been substantially superseded by a narrower attention for a selected canon of writers for whom the encounter with Dante had been aesthetically productive, vehiculating acts of imaginative recreation, intersemiotic transcodification, literary and cultural appropriation of aspects, themes, motifs, and textual logic. But the creative is only one, admittedly, the most broadly appealing side of the reception phenomenon, and I think that we today are proof of it. So the international celebration for the Dante Centenary have immersed us into the vortex of reception. And while we search for what Caselli calls the reverberating presence of Dante in modern day literary, visual, and pop culture, and this all the general attention to the centenary, we nevertheless, connected on themes from the four corners of the world, are really involved in a more markedly interpretative discourse on Dante, and we are acting as producers, receivers, as well as agents of transmission of this discourse. So, however, our experience is far from being unique. Before us, Victorian readers found themselves in a very similar situation back in 1865, the year of the very first Dante centenary, internationally celebrated and held in Florence. As much as Dante's influence at the time was already expanding through poetry, theatre, prose, the Victorians were beginning to express a more markedly critical interest and scholarly attention to the positive study of the texts and the documents relating to Dante's life and works. And so, to the point that, as Michael Caesar defined it, the age of analysis had finally begun. So soon materializing, and this I have to thank my IRC fellowship for this, into a monograph published by Manchester University Press in November 2021, let's keep our fingers crossed, My Dante's Beyond Influence conceptualizes and historicizes the hermeneutic term in Dante's British reception history. Through the analysis of 5 case studies and the material examination of a newly discovered body of manuscript and print sources, the book elucidates the sophistication of the Victorian modes of readerly and writerly engagement with Dantean textuality. It charts its outward expression as public criticism, as a kind of criticism that circulated most in 19th century periodicals, and also explore their wider popularization and also commodification through the Victorian mass publishing. It ultimately sheds light on the mechanism that led to the specialization of the scholarly discourse and the academization of Dante studies in both traditional and extramural universities. But well, back in 2019, my Dante lecture unpacked the phenomenology of Victorian Dantismo from a very particular perspective, the perspective of the Rossetti sisters, Maria Francesca and Cristina, who at the time I described as pioneering Dantists of their generation. In that occasion, I examined the way they had turned Dante from plausible object of domestic recreation to subject of independent critical industry, and also how they had negotiated with the forces of patriarchal influence to gain professional authority as public mediators of Dantean knowledge for the growing English-speaking public. With the start of my IRC, and I think this is one of the many beauties of this kind of fellowship scheme, in October 2019, the lecture continued to grow, continued to develop to the point of laying the foundation for my present project, and a project that I consider wholeheartedly as one of the earliest output of the CDSI, given the crucial impact that both Daragh and David has had in developing with me the theoretical foundation of the project through formal meetings, yes, countless coffees, yes, but also occasional pints that we are dearly missing. Their different specialism and perspectives afforded me a stimulus to expand my own reflection on the nature and the role of the woman reader in Dante. In particular, I began to reflect, to consider that although the nature and function of the textualized female audience in Dante's works has been amply investigated and beautifully investigated by Helena Lombardi most recently, scholars have remained yet largely indifferent to the far-reaching impact that women had on the modern reception, interpretation, and pedagogy of Dante's works. So tackling this vacuum, my current project carries out the first systematic inquiry into the transnational development of a stratified female public of readers, translators, illustrators, educators, scholars, and patrons in Britain, Ireland, and Italy during the long 19th century. The hope of the project is to capture the full intergenerational realization of the phenomenon within 3 distinct yet interculturally related countries that were simultaneously undergoing wider sociocultural, political, and technological transformations. This included women's increased access to education and literary professions, the industrialization of the modes of production, circulation and consumption of print media, and finally, the British-Irish participation and appropriation to a certain extent of the nation-building discourse of Italian Risorgimento, hinged on the rediscovery and rehabilitation of Dante as Italy's national poet and a central figure of the European literary canon. So methodologically, both my projects blend literary, book historical, and material approaches and use archival tools to revivify an heterogeneous corpus of manuscripts and print evidence. Different by geographical and historical scope to a certain extent, the two projects pursue a common objective, that of broadening our conversation on Dante's transnational reception and modern reading communities. So thank you very much, and I hand over to Valentina Mele.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me well. Thank you all for joining us. It's very good to see so many good friends online. And thank you, Daragh, for your beautiful presentation and introduction. What I would like to do tonight is to briefly try and illustrate some of the main questions of my research and my critical perspective through a case point. As you can grasp from my title, and as Daragh mentioned, my research focuses on the medieval poet Guido Cavalcanti, and with my project, I seek to describe how subjectivity is articulated in his poetry. I analyze primarily how the textual subject, the first-person position, is encoded and staged in the lyric of Cavalcanti. As we know, Guido Cavalcanti is one of the fundamental voices of the Italian lyric canon and is proclaimed as one of the most innovative poets of his time. His poetry has been regarded by some recent studies as particularly interesting if we seek to examine issues related to subjectivity, mostly because almost the entirety of his poetic corpus could be seen as an attempt to represent the effects of love on the subject. In fact, looking at Cavalcanti's poetry from a thematic point of view, it appears that the experience of love is almost always represented as a clash resulting from the perfection of the unattainable lady and the inadequacy of the subject, who is constantly represented as suffering and as dying for love. This process is analyzed by Cavalcanti in detail. As we know, Cavalcanti makes use of the philosophical sources of his time, and for this reason, he has been defined as the poet of interiority and the first inquirer of the self. As I briefly mentioned, I'm interested in the encoding of subjectivity, so in the subject of the enunciation, and because of this reason, my inquiry mainly focuses on deixis as the leading vector to evaluate quantitatively and qualitatively the presence and the features of the Cavalcantian subject. One of the main questions I address with my project is how is this very peculiar subject encoded and articulated on the enunciative level in the text of Cavalcanti? In order to try and answer this question, I mainly look at three aspects or areas through a comparative perspective, meaning that I analyze the occurrence and frequency of the same phenomena in the corpora of the main poets of the medieval lyric tradition, from Giacomo da Lentini to Petrarch, of course by taking into consideration their sometimes very different linguistic context. So the first aspect I look at is person deixis, and the question is, does the corpus of Cavalcanti present a higher number of personal pronouns and other forms connected to person deixis if compared to the lyric tradition? So in brief, is this thematic focus on the subject and his suffering reflected somehow on the enunciative level? Then I look at spatial and temporal deixis, trying to investigate how are spatiality and temporality encoded in the Cavalcantian love discourse, and how do these two coordinates contribute to the definition of the space and the time of the subject in the text. The third aspect I'm interested in is the contribution of voices other to that of the poet lover to the articulation of the lyric subject. This question is particularly crucial when one considers the importance of personification and prosopopeia in Cavalcanti's poetry. I would now very briefly look at one Cavalcanti's text which does not exemplify all the major trends I am observing, but which nonetheless is interesting to observe some of the phenomena I am analyzing in my research, and I'm going to read the text. A me stesso di me pietate vene, per la dolente angoscia chi mi veggio, di molta debolezza, quand'io seggio l'anima sento ricoprir di pene. Tutto mi struggo, per chi sento bene, che d'ogni angoscia la mia vita è peggio. La nuova donna, cui mercede cheggio, questa battaglia di dolor mantene. Però che, quand'i guardo verso lei, rizzami gli occhi dello suo disdegno, sì feramente, che distrugge il core. Allor si parte ogni virtù dai miei, e il cor si ferma per veduto segno, dove si lancia crudeltà d'amore. As we can see in this sonnet, the subject describes and analyzes is suffering through a self-commiserative perspective. So the lyric I pities himself for the anguish and grief he feels, and in doing so, he relates his condition to the encounter with the beloved and to her piercing eyes which have wounded his heart. What I want to briefly emphasize, and what I've tried to do by using the bold, is how the thematic focus on the subject and his self-commiserative perspective are stressed and mirrored in this text but also conveyed by a high number of first-person pronouns, and even more strikingly by the occurrence of reflective forms which emphasize the alienation of the self and the gravity of his own commiseration, even on a visual level. The first line is perhaps the most emblematic of the entire lyric, as the word order emphasizes the centrality of the io. A me stesso di me pietate vene, as the subject and the object of the pity, as well as his solipsism, so the fact that he himself acknowledges and sees his own condition. I want to conclude very briefly by stating that some of the main objectives of my research are to assess or reassess the role of Cavalcanti in the lyric tradition, to provide new tools for investigating the articulation of subjectivity in medieval love lyrics, and perhaps to further examine Cavalcanti's legacy within and outside the Italian lyric tradition. Thank you very much.
Here I am. Thank you everybody for being here tonight, and thanks to Daragh and my fellows Dantisti at UCC. As Daragh said, we start my fellowship next academic year, so I will give you just an introduction to the work that I think that I plan to do next academic year. The title of my research topic is Livy's Legacy in Dante, Petrarch and Boccaccio, the practice of reading history in Italian culture from the late 13th to the 14th century. I've been studying the reception of classical authors in Dante's works for a few years now. In my next research, I have decided to focus on the Roman historian Livy, and researching his role as the most prominent source for Roman history, not only in Dante, but also in Petrarch and Boccaccio, the so-called three crowns of Italian literature. I think we need some context here. Only a small part of Livy's monumental work, namely the first and the third decades, survived during the Middle Ages, while its circulation was still scarce. In the second half of the 13th century, the two surviving decades were rediscovered in Verona at the Biblioteca Capitolare. In the 14th century, Petrarch rediscovered also the 4th decade and provided a philological edition of Livy's work. The importance of these events for the history of European literature and culture cannot be underestimated, since the rediscovery of classical works, which had long disappeared, fueled the humanism and later the Renaissance. Also, the refunding of historiography as a literary genre was stimulated by the reading of classical works such as Livy's. In the Middle Ages, and we've seen this last week with Professor Pertile during the discussion after his talk, the status of historiography was shifting, and it tended to be considered more of a topic rather than a literary genre. So my project is to compare and contrast Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio's approach to Livy as an historiographical source. The idea of putting together the three of them in this type of research is in itself very innovating. The Vulgata has underlined several times the key role of Petrarch as well as of Boccaccio, although sometimes less clearly, I believe, in the development of a new approach to the classics during the Humanism. Dante is believed not to have shared Petrarch and Boccaccio's new involvement with the classical culture. This may be true in a certain way, and we may discuss about it. In this very case, however, I'm convinced that Dante had some access to the work of Livy, almost certainly in the last part of his life, when he stayed in Verona at the court of Can Grande della Scala. I find it stimulating, the perspective of embracing all the three authors in a new investigation to the roots of humanism and Renaissance, following the rediscovery of Livy and the rebirth of historiography. How can this be done? Livy's work is huge, even the part that we know today, and also especially Petrarch and Boccaccio's production. Their pre-humanistic production is very big. So I plan to focus on a well-defined canon of historical characters who reappear in the Three Crowns and feature in Livy as well. The male characters formed a consistent group since the classical period, for example, in a work that was so important during all the Middle Ages, Augustine's City of God. And although there were some variations, this group constantly revolved around a specific number of Roman illustrious men, mostly from Republican age. The situation for the illustrious women is more complicated because there isn't anything comparable to the group of illustrious men. So I will try to focus on several female figures, both from ancient Rome and mentioned by Livy, as well as some non-Livian female characters from pre-Roman history. Another thing that I plan to do is connected to manuscripts and some unpublished works. I think that the new historical knowledge has penetrated the Florence of the end of the 13th century. After all, it was there that the British Dominican Nicholas Trevet commented on the first and third decade for the very first time. And I plan to study his commentary, which is still unpublished, and also about these technicalities of my work. We can talk these details, so we can talk more about after the end of the presentation, if you wish. I just want to say something about how this work relates to my previous work. I'm currently working on my first monograph about the classical sources of Dante's Inferno, and in this book I mainly focus on Latin poets, the poets of the so-called epic canon, so Vergil, Tatius in particular, but also Ovid and Lucan. I'm also participating in a project called the Hypermedia Dante Network, whose goal is to create a database of the sources of the Commedia. So my work on the Three Crowns and Livy is meant to be a more rich and ambitious research in the field in which I've been building my expertise. Thank you. And now Dario Galassini.
Okay. First of all, thanks, Dara, for that priceless introduction, and thank you to my colleagues for their brilliant papers. My name is Dario Galassini. Buonasera a tutte, buonasera a tutti. I think we are running a bit late, so to begin with, we shall say that 20th century Italian literature and poetry above all is deeply influenced by Dante Alighieri's artistic production. Can we trace a shared path leading to that? And why do modern authors use Dante's words and ideas? What is Dante communicating to them? Although the number of scholars dealing with the subject is increasing, it seems that a more considered view on this type of intertextuality is lacking. Traditional investigations of Dantean influence in 20th century poetry have tended to privilege canonical names of the Italian literary canon and prefer the commentary or analysis of single texts instead of a broader examination. As Dara said, for my 4-year PhD project here at UCC, I will investigate the Dantean references in the works of Giorgio Caproni, Antonia Potsi, Vittorio Sereni, and Mario Luzzi. My project offers a generational perspective with a specific focus on Dantean presences. These 4 authors merge as one cohesive group for multiple reasons. The theoretical concept of generation identifies shared perspectives, values, and experiences, plus a cultural, social, political, and economic substratum. They were born between 1912 and 1914 in Lombardy or Tuscany. Potsi and Sereni attended the same high school in Milan and were friends. Sereni and Caproni were frequently in contact via letters, as their epistolary proves. Caproni and Luzzi shared mutual respect and intellectual esteem, as documented in other sources. I will follow a thematic path and map every reference, both the open and opaque, in searching for those Dantean elements that represent a cornerstone, in proposing the word of the Commedia again in new clothing. Today I will focus on a very brief introduction of Antonia Potsi while conducting a swift analysis of some of her poems. Reading the poetry of Potsi through the lens of Dantean intertextuality is something entirely new. As I was saying, her poetic oeuvre has attracted little attention from critics throughout the years if compared to other 20th century Italian writers, and none of these academic contributions delves into the relationship between her literary work and Dante. As it happens, her poems were unpublished while she was alive and thus largely ignored. After their publication in the form of a private printing in 1939, the publishing house Mondadori edited a volume in 1943 that was received favorably even by Montale, who was asked to review the book. She was then slowly discovered by the public and the critics, but the first significant essays and articles did not emerge until the 1980s. Most of the material available to this point is of little interest to my PhD project and instead offers narrow perspectives, interpreting Potsi's poems as if they were just a daily diary. While the investigation of an individual writer's life is an essential part of criticism, it is but one aspect for a richer understanding of the text. In the end, these contributions seem short-sighted and theoretically inadequate, and they do not provide a solid foundation on which to build detailed thematic paths. Her text may be classified as lyric poetry or nature writing, but is indeed necessary to inscribe Potsi in a broader canon, which gives her a peculiar role in describing the world in which she lived in, from a cultural, social, political, and philosophical point of view. Besides, she is the only female author in my small canon, and the analysis and interpretation of her poems will provide a singular insight on Dante's work. Paraphrasing Olson's essay studying Antonia Potsi and their ties to Dante, I will investigate the language of men as rewritten by women, and this will help me understand if and how gender differently influences reading activities and the parodic transformations of a textual model too. I think it could be interesting to start from some echoes of Inferno 1, lines 1-3 in her poetry. This overview does not have any presumption of being thorough, since it is just preliminary and brief, also given the circumstances of this roundtable event. However, I will demonstrate how frequent the image of the Dantean cammino is, and how it is always in constant evolution. The idea of a path passing through a forest in which the self roams and loses the awareness of time and space is stimulating, and merges with the personal interest of Potsi, who is an enthusiastic mountaineer. Nonetheless, it would be a mistake to read these references just taking into consideration the natural background in which the poems are set, or the action takes place. This is clearly shown by one of the first texts entitled Presentimenti d'Azzurro. Here, the subject watches the sky through a window and believes she can fly, just by throwing herself onto the clouds. It is the only way not for losing her consciousness in sinuous roads. Lines 13 and 14 recall Dante's character, lost in the selva oscura, but of opposite tendencies. That outcome is now discouraged if the self can find her way through the clouds, not getting lost. The same image is evoked in Largo, but now presented as a precise will of the subject. Through the quotation of the imperative lasciate, read on the Inferno door in Canto 3, the self sets off her desire of vanishing into the shadows of the evening and its own ghostly roads. Then we find the path as a pathway to the return journey, anostos. It is the case of poems like In riva alla vita, L'orma del vento, Rossori, where the well-known road is now silent, deserted, and abandoned. The loneliness of a subject who is the sole wanderer proceeding on this journey leads to the cry for help intrinsic in the expressions Tristo cammino and Strada maledetta in I fiori, which is not in the PowerPoint presentation, and to the simile of the pilgrim that has lost everything before his arrival to the Holy Sepulchre. Lastly, the subject becomes the viator in Sera, one of Pozzi's most Dantean poems. Here, the expression improvvisa solitudine resembles the mi ritrovai, as if both narrations suggest the idea of the two characters being trapped in a situation they had not anticipated. The term itself, viandante, further supports this parallelism. In the background, women are calling for assistance, this being the only human presence the wayfarer can spot. Maybe their voices are asking for some distant friend or a generic person who is expected but is late for the homecoming. This again is what Dante character does when he sees Virgil for the first time. Miserere di me, he says. The difference then lies in the outcome. In the Selva Oscura, Virgil introduces himself to Dante as his guide and appeases him in front of the last of the three beasts. In Sera, the women do not get answers from the Viator, nor from anybody else, and the only thing they can do is entrench themselves in their bare homes. The last audible sound is that of closing doors, setting up the idea of no possible escape from this reality lived in loneliness. As I was saying, and I have shown in this brief presentation on Potsi, considering the poet's collective poetic output, some preliminary readings make it clear that Dante influenced their poetry in narration, style, lexicon. Whilst Lucy has received serious critical attention, Caproni's straightforward use of Dante is only beginning to be examined properly. Sereni's and Pozi's appropriation is discreet and has elicited very little critical attention thus far, a fact that my project seeks to redress. My perspective will focus on the sedimentation of textual echoes rather than proceeding with the isolation of individual elements of Dante's texts. Then the point of view will switch to how these four authors' oeuvre reinvent the hypotexts in a way that shows how the precursor already contains the possibility for later readers to rethink or distort the work. And that's it. Thank you for your time, and I hand it back to Day and Fede.
Back to me again. Hello again, everybody. So I'm here to talk to you about a collaborative project that David and I started a bit before either of us became IRC postdoc fellows, and which has gone through a steady path of development over the past 4 years. So the project, called Mediating Dante, originated with 2 panels organized for the American Association of Italian Studies conference that was held in Sorrento in 2018. The panels titled Seeing with Dante focused on the role played by the visual arts in the cross-cultural mediation and interpretation, appropriation, and popularization of Dante's textuality and imagery from the early modern era to postmodernity. This first successful enterprise was followed in June 2019 by a study day held at UCC and sponsored by Casilac, Medium Havum, and the IRC. And the event established a transnational research network with the participation of established scholars and early career researchers from Ireland, the UK, and the US. The results of this research day are forthcoming in a special issue of Italian Studies that David will discuss a bit further. in detail later on. However, earlier in 2020, shortly before the outbreak of the pandemic, David and I co-organized also another study day on mediating icons with the University of Hull, presenting our respective work on Evelyn Paul's illuminated edition of the Vita Nuova and Rachel Owen's illustrations to the Inferno. And here I hand over to David. The second part.
Thank you, Fede. As Fede said, this is a conversation which has been kind of gradually emerging over many years, and in many ways, it actually started on Twitter when we were, I think, following some of the same conversations, and we realised that we were going to be in the same city, and so had coffee and a catch up, and that has led to a long and fruitful now 5 or 6 years of collaboration, including a number of panels and other events. Mentioning Twitter, I should also point out that if anyone is tweeting about anything that's going on this evening, that as most of us are indeed Irish Research Council present, future, and former postdoctoral researchers. The relevant hashtag is Love Irish Research, as featured on the bottom of the current slide. It would be remiss of me not to mention it. As Federica mentioned, the primary published outcome of that workshop is going to be a special issue of Mediating Dante. A special issue of Italian studies on the theme of Mediating Dante. I'm not going to go into kind of excessive particular detail, as we're at the stage of kind of gathering essays and sending them for review, and I don't want to kind of go into too much detail on individual essays. But what I did want to do was just introduce some of the kind of bigger questions that we are asking of our contributors, and which our contributors are asking in their approaches to the question of mediating Dante for this issue. So as you see, we've divided this up across two major thematic groupings: forms of reading and iconography to iconicity. Several of these are terms which have already come up at various points over the course of this evening, and indeed the question of iconography to iconicity is something which our thinking on was really sharpened in collaboration with colleagues in Italian at Hull in one of their final events at that same workshop that Federica mentioned just now. So what are the kind of questions we're asking under these banners? Well, rather than just kind of reading what's on the PowerPoint to you, I want to kind of try and synthesize what these questions mean to us. And fundamentally, I think they're about the kind of questions we're interested in are ones of, and the questions that emerge from this study day are ones of forms of recreation or forms of creation that go beyond the kind of notion of reception to really think about. And one of the really common themes was really the sense of these mediations as not just things in between us and the text, but almost gateways to the text. So things that both create something of their own, but also create almost a portal to the text itself, which isn't to privilege a notion of the original and the adaptation in the same way that we wouldn't necessarily want to privilege the notion of the original and the translation, but to think about the ways in which these kind of related cultural artifacts are in a form of dialogue, a dialoguing across time, across language, across different media, whether that be a manuscript text to the intricate hand created but then mass printed typographies of someone like Vivian Paul, or whether that be from the relationship between manuscript image and photographic illustration or collage. In approaching these questions, the papers provoked us to really think about what we meant when we were talking about mediating, not just in terms of because we posed a general question and we were given some very specific answers, which raised some fascinating questions of what it means. And I want to hone on this question: what does it mean to create a new reading? And it allowed us, I think, to focus in on our own practice as critics as well, because what we are fundamentally doing is, and Federica mentioned this in her talk on her own research, is engaging in a process which fundamentally is creative in its own sense, right? By reading these texts, by presenting our interpretations of these texts, we're not just reading them, we are creating a reading, we're presenting a reading which becomes its own cultural artifact. And we were very interested by the ways in which that notion of creating a reading as an interpretive act as a critic or a researcher is engaged with in dialogue also with the idea of creating a reading through illustration, through visual arts, through rewriting, through translation, through the framing of a modern edition, and how we could kind of engage with different questions of the form of the text, the form of readership, and the form of the kind of the new version or the intermediating version or encounter with the text that kind of emerged. So I just want to say, give the two specific examples of Federica's own work on Oberlin and Paul, and my work on Rachel Owen's Inferno illustrations, because I don't want to, as I said, I don't want to go into too much detail into kind of ins and outs of the volume right now. But those are things which not only have taken shape in terms of the discussion of the study day, and also then in the ultimate hopefully in the ultimate publication once they've gone through the review processes, but have also kind of spun off to inform our individual projects as well, both in terms of the volume that I'm publishing with Bodleian Library Publishing, and in terms of Federica's own publications. So this has been a space of both collaboration with colleagues from across Ireland, Europe, the UK, and the US, a space of discussion within the kind of what was at that point the Proto Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland, but also something which has then gone back and as all the best collaborations do, has both informed the project itself and informed our own work, echoing out from that project. So that's the point at which I'm going to leave it, and I think hand back to Daragh.
Okay, thanks, David. All right, so we're just going to wrap up here, guys. And as you know, 2021 marks the sepcentenary of Dante's death. So internationally, obviously, there are many, many events. There's a myriad of events going on in which we are going to be partaking in ourselves. There is this strange thing called Dante D, which ultimately translates as Dante Day. And that is going to be, that happens, it's globally on the 25th of March. So we thought this year, by way of marking Dante Day, what we would do is we would host an online exhibition. Just very briefly, a bit of context for you. Back in 2014, we hosted a very successful exhibition in the Bowe Library of the artist Liam O'Brien's lithographs inspired by the Inferno. And since in the intervening years, Liam has completed the whole suite of lithographs for the whole of the Commedia, but there are 100 lithographs. And so this exhibition was due to take place in Dublin Castle, and obviously because of COVID, this cannot happen. So given that this is a unique collection, that no other artist in Ireland has ever attempted something quite on this scale, we approached Liam, bearing in mind that this is such an important year in kind of Dante studies, and we decided to put together an online exhibition of Liam's 100 lithographs. So we're going to launch the exhibition on the 25th of March. We are going to move over to Zoom to do it. We're going to move away from Teams. There's a picture of Liam with his daughter there, working on one of the lithographs from Inferno 10. And to the right there, you will also see that wonderful lithograph that I'm always impressed by, of Canto 13 of Pierre de la Vigne in the Inferno. So that will be one of our next events coming up on the 25th of March. And the exhibition will run from March until the end of December. And trust me, you are going to want to come along and visit this and visit the website at regular intervals. Also, we are planning something slightly different. We're trying to move away, I suppose, from the traditional academic paper and explore Dante really through dialogue, through conversation. And so we've set up a spring selection of Dante dialogues. And these are really intended to kind of bring together people from different types of backgrounds. The first one we're going to do is actually going to launch David's book, The Poetry and Dialogue in the Duecento and Dante. And we're lucky to have a friend of the centre and who has spoken in the series, Tristan Kay, And also Akash Kumar is going to be speaking with us from over in the States, and Valentina Mele is going to mediate that one. And that is on Friday, March the 19th, and that is going to be on Zoom, and I'm going to advertise these events over the coming days. After that, in April, we're then going to have Approaching Dante, and we're going to look at some new publications. We did a little bit of a plug for George's book unexpectedly last week, but we're going to do it again. This is Dante's Christian Ethics, Purgatory and its Moral Context, and also Simone Marchese's wonderful with Roberta Beati's A proposito di Dante, 100 passi nella commedia con disegni. And we're getting George and Simone together, and our friend and collaborator Heather Webb from Cambridge is going to dialogue with the two of them. Then we have a very special one coming up later on towards the end of April, and this is going to be something that Federica is organizing, that is Collecting Dante, looking at Dante between archives and libraries. And this is going to happen with Christian Dupont and Corinna Salvadori, and then also Illustrating Dante again. This is going to be in May, I think, although the date's been knocked off the slide there. Manuscripts, Medieval and Modern. This is going to bring together Melissa Conway and George Cochran. David, do you want to say a couple of words on that?
Yeah, just to confirm that will be in May, and we'll circulate information near the time. That one's probably going to be slightly later in the day to accommodate East and West Coast time zones in the US, as Melissa and George will both be talking to us from either side of the United States. And again, this is very much something which has been born actually out of the kind of Twitter activity of the centre itself. So if you don't already, please do follow us at Dante in Ireland on Twitter, where Melissa and George have both been presenting. In Melissa's case, her digital archival explorations of illustrated Dante manuscripts, and in George's case, the work in progress on his full illustrated Dante manuscript. So he's created a full new manuscript of the Divine Comedy with hand lettering and illustrations. He's an artist with a background in comics and graphic novels, and it really is quite a remarkable piece of work. And that will be being published later this year. And so this talk will roughly coincide with an exhibition of the work in Perugia. And they're going to be talking from those two different perspectives about what it means to illustrate Dante, both from the kind of the sense of the perspective of an archivist and librarian, and from the perspective of an active practitioner.
That's great stuff. Okay, folks. So we're going to wrap it up here. And before passing over to Sylvia, I just want to say before I finish off with this PowerPoint, just again, once more, thanks to everybody in languages, to Kazlak in particular, everybody in the Department of Italian. I'd also just want to mention one or two other things by way of thanking people. The Leeds Centre for Dante Studies, Matthew Traherne and Claire Holmes, back in the day, were pivotal really in kind of helping us kind of get Dante off the mark here in a more kind of concerted and national way through our Dante study days with Irish undergraduate students. And I've always really appreciated the kind of collaborative energies of our colleagues around the UK and in Ireland. And in particular, I want to mention also Claudia Rossignoli and Robert Wilson in St Andrews for their, bringing many of us to Scotland to partake in the wonderful Lectura Dantis Andrea Politana. And also, I suppose, Giuseppe Ledda and Simon Gilson, for supporting this venture. When I remember I first broached the subject to them in a pub in Edinburgh, they were very much in favour of it. So that's enough from us. I'm going to stop this PowerPoint now, and I'm going to pass over to my colleague and head of the department, Sylvia Ross.
Hi, thanks. You can see me, can you? Yeah. Okay. I understand last week my hair looked purple because of the strange lighting, so hopefully these strange effects aren't happening this week. So I'm so delighted to be here at this virtual inauguration of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland. The foundation of the centre crowns more than a decade of Dante events and initiatives spearheaded by Daragh O'Connell, while also charting the path for the years to come. The centre will now give a name and identity to all the fruitful and dynamic research activity which coalesces around Dante in UCC. And under Daragh's leadership, Dante studies have flourished here, not only via the 10 years of Dante public lectures, which are now reaching out across the globe thanks to this online format, and grazie COVID-19, one of the few silver linings to this situation. But also due to the various publications, the articles, edited volumes, monographs on Dante produced here at UCC, and a number of other initiatives, of which I'll mention just some of the highlights, and apologies, of course, for leaving several things out. I can't cover 10 years of work in just a couple minutes here, but these include the Dante Study Day that Daragh just mentioned, which saw Claire Honus and Matthew Traherne of the Leeds Centre for Dante Studies make the trek here to Cork on various occasions to teach the Commedia to undergraduates, not only from UCC, but from across Ireland in day-long workshop format. Other events include the Ad Astra per Aspera Dante readings in honor of the 750th anniversary of Dante's birth. And the readings took place in December 2015 in collaboration with colleagues in Dublin and the Italian Cultural Institute. The readings began with Inferno in the National Gallery in Dublin, opened by President Michael D. Higgins, no less, reading the first canto. Then the following weekend, many colleagues will recall, we read Purgatorio here at UCC on different levels of the Glucksmann Gallery and in various languages involving colleagues and students. And then the concluding readings of Paradiso took place in the chapel of Trinity College, Dublin. Also, many colleagues will recall, Daragh has organized art exhibitions on Dante here in UCC, including now becoming virtual art exhibitions. And also he stewarded the purchase of the precious volume Dante con le esposizioni di Cristoforo Landino ed Alessandro Vellutello of 1596, which is housed in the special collections of the UCC library. And every year, this year, not because of the virtual format, but every year normally, Daragh would take the final year students in his class down to the special collections, and they actually get to see the volume itself in the tangible form. So, and in these most recent years, we've been so fortunate that we have managed to attract emerging scholars on Dante to the department and to the school, both IRC postdocs and postgraduates on scholarships, evidence that the impact of Dante studies here in Cork is rippling out further and creating a community for early career researchers. So thank you to David Bowe and Federica Colluzzi, Valentina Mele, Leyla Livraghi and Dario Galassini, to all of you for speaking so eloquently this evening. And all these events I've mentioned are marked by, I would say, collaboration and collegiality, because they've been a hallmark of all these different events and activities. And this is thanks to Daragh, who is expertly drawn in, or should I say in some cases twisted arms a little bit, of colleagues, both within the Department of Italian and the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures, and other areas such as English, History of Art, and Irish, as well as international speakers coming from the UK, from the EU, and from the US. So what's so special about the Centre, I think, is that it brings Dante to life for us all in the present, not only as the subject of research, but also, and importantly, in our teaching, as well as in the numerous outreach activities that have already been highlighted this evening for a wider public across a variety of media and forms. So, hats off to Daragh for all his work in this area. And so all I can say is please raise a glass with me, if you have one, to toast this excellent beginning of a new chapter, or should I say canto perhaps, in Dante studies in UCC, in Ireland and beyond. So salute alla vostra, cin cin.
Alla vostra.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was very nice of you. Pat, are you there?
I am here, Daragh.
Where's he going?
I am here. I'm here, Daragh. Yep.
There you are. Good.
Yes.
It's you now. Did you want to say something?
Well, I mean, I think everything really has been said, and I think everybody's very tired, maybe at this point in the night, having heard such, I guess, such wonderful presentations. I would like to recall, however, how maybe it was 6 years ago, on January the 20th, in fact, and back in 2015, Daragh, you kindly invited me to say a few words to mark the purchase and on that occasion the public display of Dante's Divine Comedy, which was published in Venice in 1596. And it was a lovely occasion. It was one of the first occasions, I think, that began to kind of mark the foundation of CASLAC, the Centre for Advanced Studies in Languages and Cultures within the school. And I remember looking at the book. We had it in the social area in the O'Reilly building. And it was a delicious kind of pleasure, really, to apprehend it. I guess its obvious intrinsic value and its clear relationship to the scholarship already in place within the Department of Italian and within the school. And it had this wonderful, I suppose, emblematic and symbolic capital. And I remember we were reflecting then on it as a material artifact and how its value would be returned, we hoped, year upon year, in a way that would prompt research in areas such as cultural transmission. And since then, and tonight brilliantly, we've heard from postgraduate and postdoctoral scholars who have been attracted to your work and to the work in the Department of Italian on Dante and their success in the Irish Research Council. And it's something to celebrate. And it's something to celebrate the fact that the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland is now integrated within the research clusters of CASLAC and has a position and role within the school. I want to thank you, Daragh, for brilliantly leading on the development, the expansion, and the deepening of Dante Studies, for encouraging so many young scholars, almost like Virgil, putting his arm around Dante and bringing him and helping him through the wood. And I think that your role as a mentor and as a guide and of your goodwill towards Dante scholars has been exemplary as a mentor. I want to finish by saying that over the last few weeks, I've listened to these wonderful papers on faith and on creativity, on greed and on betrayal. And I'm struck by the wonderful scholarship. I've heard scholars whose approach is very much to do with the kinds of narratology and structuralist approach that I've always valued and sometimes I feel is ignored. And yet through the clarity of these approaches, there's this wonderful humanity. And I think the effect of listening to these papers has been, I would say, on occasion, spiritual. Dante's work reminds us of our humanity. And I'm thinking of that, the idea of out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. And I wonder if Kant was thinking there of Canto 13 that you referenced earlier on. So thank you, Daragh, for establishing this centre. And thank you to all of the scholars who participated tonight. And I look forward to seeing the centre grow, evolve, develop, and enrich our lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you. Okay, that's one. Corinna, do you want to say something?
I hope I can now be heard.
Yes, yes.
Yes, good. Well, I'm actually overcome and I'm not going to say what I had thought I was going to say at all. I'm going to be saying something different because it's really been a most extraordinary event. These wonderful scholars you have working with you. And I'm particularly grateful to Sylvia because she has put so compactly this Dante presence in Cork that has absolutely developed and strengthened, and the wonderful research in the past slightly more than 10 years. And what I had brought with me to show this evening was Piero Calli's, I don't know if it can be seen, but Piero Calli's book on Dante and Langland, which came out in 1971. And the reason I thought of this was because I was there. I belong to Cork since those early times. I collaborated, and collaboration is Sylvia's word. I collaborated with Piero. I collaborated with Anne Callaghan, with Catherine O'Brien, and indeed with Professor Byrne Costigan earlier than that. And Cork has always been very special for me. I have had such deep regard for Cork's Italian department, but also very much affection. And nothing could have given me greater happiness than one of my most brilliant students ever, someone with whom I have journeyed 30 years, Daragh, I hope you remember, is now in Cork and doing such great, great work. Now, I also want to speak, well, in terms of Dante series and publications, because again, I had brought along the very first publication from University College Dublin, and sponsored always in these publications by the Italian Cultural Institute. And this is the first one that ever came out in 1977. And 1977. This is Dante Commentaries, and this was the bringing together of 5 years of Dante lectures by David Nolan. And David's idea in this was precisely to invite established scholars, but also young voices, new people who would be the future of Dante Studies, and to give these lectures in UCD. He gave such dedication to them. And you know, this first little simple volume, because there wasn't the money and that's how one did things so long ago, it has, you know, contributions by Humphrey Whitfield, by John Scott, by Peter Armour, as well as Piero Calli, and indeed a superb Inferno 19 by David Nolan himself. That was the beginning. And then what I want to show you is the last in that series, which John Barnes took over when David died so prematurely, and John Barnes took over and continued and expanded and gave his all to these great lectures in UCD that we had year after year. And this is the last volume. And this last volume was in 2017, exactly, was it 40 years after the very first one, which I think is wonderful. And this is Dante and the Seven Deadly Sins, and there is an excellent essay. If you want to know about envy in Dante, read Daragh in this book, right? I heartily recommend it, but I recommend the whole book. I think it is really a must read for Dante scholars. And I think that John Barnes gave his all really to producing this Dante and collecting all the lectures, and very, very rigorous editing, and indeed helped by his colleagues. And as I say, Daragh was one of the fellow editors here, but several other colleagues who worked with David Nolan, with John Barnes, on that great series. Then, of course, it all ended in UCD because John Barnes retired. And indeed, retirement changed the position of Dante in Trinity, because in our department is the oldest in these islands, of 1776 was the foundation, and Dante was always a presence, and Dante was very much compulsory in the degree course which I inherited when I went to Trinity. And it wasn't just the Commedia that was the compulsory reading for undergraduates, but you also did 4 other works, the Vita Nuova, the Convivio, the Vulgari Eloquentia, and the Monarchy. It was very serious, your Dante paper, because if you failed it at degree, there was no such thing as compensation. You just did not get the degree in Italian. And I never questioned it as a feature of our course, and indeed a cornerstone. I never questioned it, because it always convinced me that this very, very great poet of the world, not just of Italy, deserved thorough study. and that our graduates would leave knowing their Dante and being shaped by Dante for the rest of their lives. And indeed, to this day, I'm in touch with students who did their Dante 40 and more years ago. And 2 graduates from that course, Daragh O'Connell and Kenneth Clark, I think are both exemplary in that they have truly shown the fulfillment that it has given them and how they have carried on in Italian studies, specifically Dante and Boccaccio. And they're, I think, a great credit to our department. And it was a great pleasure for me to teach that course with Cormac O'Quillanoine. Cormac, who is such a first-class medievalist, so expert, so urbane, and in our different ways, we were able to deliver a course that I think we were really both proud of. Now, things then changed because we both retired, and Dante was given, colleagues believed in a rejuvenated course, in something more modern, and I am very, very glad that Daragh in Cork got the support from both the department and the university to start those Dante public lectures, carrying on from John Barnes, and that they have flourished with such great success. So the way I look at it is, Dante seems always to have been in some way or other an exul in meritus. He has found in the centre a vita nuova. He has found a centre dedicated entirely to himself, and he has the whole of Ireland with him. So what I want to do is celebrate the Luce Nuova, the Sole Nuovo, and I very, very warmly commend, and with much gratitude, the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures, Mark Chu and Sylvia Ross, great colleagues in Italian, Pat Crowley as the head of the school, for supporting Daragh's idea, for enabling all that Dante research to come to fruition and to have promise of more ahead. All of it to be a centre that will give, and I shall quote Dante again, darà luce a coloro che sono in tenebre. So to the centre, to Daragh and all those who've made it possible, let us raise the glass. Like Sylvia, I have my Prosecco. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say this for Daragh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, Corinna.
Thank you, Corinna. I think before I hand over to Simon, just to say the last 2 words, I'm going to ask someone called Giuseppe Ledda di parlarci un po' in italiano. Giuseppe, ci sei?
Sì, ci sono, grazie.
Ciao Giuseppe.
Ciao ragazzi, ciao a tutti. Ma dopo però queste parole meravigliose di Corinna, cosa si può dire? Io speravo di dire, io parlo un pochino nella lingua di Dante, ma l'ha già fatto Corinna meravigliosamente con tutto quello che ha detto. Davvero una bellissima serata, e soprattutto sono quasi commosso da vedere, diciamo, l'esito del lavoro, della passione, del senso dell'amicizia, del senso della fiducia nei giovani, nel voler dare loro delle opportunità, perché questo poi mi sembra la cosa più grande, più speciale di questo centro di ricerca, che stasera abbiamo sentito, no, tutta l'energia di questi giovani, che sono alcuni tra i più bravi al mondo, e sono lì a portare le loro idee, a svilupparle, a dialogare, ad aprire prospettive nuove. E quindi sono grato a Daragh e ai colleghi di Cork per tutto quello che hanno organizzato in questi anni, le lectures. Tra l'altro l'ultimo mio viaggio, anzi il penultimo prima del lockdown, è stato proprio a Cork nel febbraio 2020, quindi in quest'anno in cui non ho potuto viaggiare ma solo ripensare agli ultimi viaggi, Cork era sempre nella mia mente. E poco prima, invece, qualche mese prima, ero stato a Edimburgo, dove ricordo il culmine della conferenza, come la chiamano i dottorandi italiani in Gran Bretagna, della SIS. Il culmine di quei giorni è stata la serata al pub con Daragh e con Simon, e lì Daragh ci ha aperto, diciamo, questo suo sogno, questa sua idea, e quindi io e Simon l'abbiamo accolta con entusiasmo, abbiamo incoraggiato con tutte le nostre energie, e vedere adesso questa riuscita straordinaria. Ma al di là del centro, al di là delle cose che si possono fare, io direi questa straordinaria capacità di attrarre alcuni tra i giovani più bravi, dare la possibilità in quel momento difficile, dopo il dottorato, o in cui insomma ci vuole una spinta perché non si perda la fiducia, l'energia, le prospettive, non ci si adatti magari ad abbassare i sogni, e invece questo è davvero qualcosa dove ci vuole grandissima capacità di organizzare, di attrarre, di raccogliere i fondi, di aprire queste opportunità. Quindi quella è veramente la cosa. E poi per noi in Italia è fondamentale avere, diciamo, molti dantismi stranieri con cui dialogare e in dialogo tra loro. Altrimenti ce la suoniamo e ce la cantiamo come abbiamo fatto purtroppo in alcune fasi, no, della storia della ricezione di Dante, con esiti così noiosi, se non altro, ecco. E invece davvero grazie alle prospettive che vengono da fuori, quando poi sono così forti, così solide, così fondate, così innovative, anche noi possiamo, ecco, aprirci a modi nuovi di leggere Dante. E quindi è fondamentale, in anni in cui diciamo altre sedi, altre aree magari sono un pochino in una fase in cui così hanno una spinta propulsiva meno efficace che in altri momenti, avere invece in Irlanda e a Cork in particolare questa energia per noi è fondamentale, insomma. Quindi grazie per tutto questo, e insomma spero davvero di poter continuare, ecco, come ho fatto in questi anni, ma ancora più fortemente, a collaborare con Daragh, con tutti i colleghi di Cork e col Center for Dante Studies in Ireland di Cork. Grazie a tutti, e io brindo col vermentino sardo, e auguri a tutti.
Grazie Giuseppe.
Okay, now I'm going to ask Simon as chair of the SIS to maybe say a couple of concluding words.
Thank you, Dario. I mean, it gets ever more impossible to follow all the previous speakers, and I mean, I'm going to be very, very brief, really. And I just want to represent the Society for Italian Studies, which is the main subject association, embracing all those with passion and interest in Italian throughout the UK and Ireland. Ireland is absolutely central and so important to the Society for Italian Studies, our representation. And I know, Dario, you've been involved in the Society in really major ways, and Sylvia and Mark and other colleagues at Cork and many other colleagues throughout Ireland have done as well. So it's been a fantastic evening. I mean, so rich, stimulating, penetrating, emotional. I don't really know quite, I mean, I can't follow any of it. I just want to congratulate Cork for having had the kind of foresight to want to invest in this centre, the colleagues in Italian at Cork as well for their wonderful support of you, and to you, Dario, you know, for that irrepressible energy and openness and desire to want to share and help others. I mean, the only thing I'd note is it's so strange to see you with a wine glass in your hand or prosecco flute. We should almost get a photo of that rather than a pint pot. But if that's not too low a moment, I just wanted to really send my best wishes for the centre that I know will go from strength to strength, and a big saluto from the SIS. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. That's wonderful. Before we go, folks, I mean, obviously people are free to kind of stay on and chat, but can I just say one thing about this evening's papers? And first of all, just to the five of them, I thought they were really, really excellent, and they were very clear in what they were talking about, because they are what this centre is all about, and it's their research that what this is about. But I just want to point out one thing, that this evening Dario Galassini gave his first ever paper. I think that alone, he deserves a special congratulations. So well done, Dario. Well, that's it.
You wouldn't have known.
There's nothing really left to say. Thank you. And well, first of all, lastly, I suppose I just want to thank everybody for tuning in for the last 5 weeks. It's been really great to have so many people in so many numbers. These are strange times. As we know, everybody's living through different kinds of realities. But this has allowed us to kind of reach out in a way we never thought possible before. And hopefully we can maintain this audience next year. But we'll be out of this situation. We've got to be positive, and usciremo a riveder le stelle. So anyway, thanks a lot, everybody, and bid you all a good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Daragh. Thank you very much.
Daragh.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daragh.
Many congratulations.
Thank you.
Everybody,
very
thank
much.
you.
Grazie, auguri.
Warm congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, Daragh.
Thank you, grazie.
Ooh, nice. Good night.